Good evening, everyone. My name is Diana Wynand. I'm chair of the San Fernando Valley Climate Reality Chapter. So glad you're all here tonight. We have a really amazing program with two very special guest speakers and look forward to introducing them both to you very soon. Before we pitch it to them and have them get started, we always like to open our meetings with a land acknowledgement. So we are going to do that now. And before I introduce the person who's going to speak and share the land acknowledgement, I just first want to acknowledge the group of people that brought this program to life tonight. And that is our, we call them EJRON pod, and it stands for Environmental Justice Rights of Nature. And that pod includes five folks on the call. So just wave or put your hand up when I call your name. So Christy Pace and Kim Neistat, Malcolm Morrell, Judy Glass is the leader, and Tara Sitzer. So they are both off screen. But I just want to, thank you guys for doing such hard work and bringing this program to life. Okay, let's go ahead and I want to introduce now Malcolm Morrell. Malcolm, would you please share the land acknowledgement? And while you do that, I'm going to share the screen so people can read it as you go.
Okay, thank you. A land acknowledgement is the formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. It acknowledges the history that has brought us to reside on this land and the colonialism that is present in our current systems and calls on us to be mindful of our own present participation in it. We acknowledge that tonight we are on the traditional territory of the Tongva, Kizh, Tataviam, and Chumash tribes. I would also like to honor the Mescalero Apache people on whose land I was born and whose trails I ran, some of them thousands of years old, people whose tears I felt even as a young boy romping with my friends in the mountains and deserts of southern New Mexico. I also acknowledge the Hawaiian people on whose lands and seas I learned to love and respect the earth and the people and nature even more, in whose very language those connections are embedded, whose Kuleana system, land care system based on family honor and raising children from an early age on the principles of oneness and stewardship, sustains life in balance for millions of Hawaiians prior to the contact from the outside world. We open our hearts to learn from the wisdom of those who have cared successfully for the land long before we arrived.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. We appreciate that. Now let's get into the program. Tonight's program is Making Ecocide a Crime, a Hope for the Future. And again, the EJRON, Environmental Justice Rights of Nature group, worked very hard on this. And Judy Glass is the coordinator. Judy has written something that I believe Christy is going to read to lead us into the program. Is that right, Christy?
Yes.
Great. All right, take it away.
So these are the words of Judith Glass. So tonight's program continues our interest in protecting the rights of nature, acknowledging that the natural world, trees, mountains, rivers, birds, and animals, is alive and has a right to thrive. The idea that nature has a right to thrive is a very recent addition to the slow historical expansion of human rights from kings to white men to all men, then to women and children. That acknowledgement is only the beginning, however. We know that rights have to be protected by custom and by law and enforced against predators. Tonight we will bring you that conversation. As you listen, please write your questions in the chat. Kim Neistat will introduce our first speaker.
We are excited and honored to have Lisa Oldring speak with us tonight. Lisa is an international human rights lawyer with over 20 years of practice at the global level, primarily with the United Nations Human Rights Office. She began her UN work in the post-conflict human rights field operation in Rwanda. Lisa is also a PhD researcher at the University of Amsterdam Faculty of Law, with her research focusing on the crime of ecocide from a human rights perspective. In addition, Lisa is a senior fellow with the UCLA School of Law Promise Institute Europe and serves as a pro bono advisor to Stop Ecocide International and Stop Ecocide Canada. We are pleased to have Lisa with us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. And our second speaker is Steven Donziger. It's my pleasure to introduce you, Steven, a lawyer and climate activist who has been the target of an oil company revenge campaign for over 30 years. 2013, Steven helped the Amazon communities in Ecuador with the largest environmental judgment in history when a court ordered Chevron to pay $9.5 billion, which is $12 billion today, to restore ancestral lands despoiled by the dumping of billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste. In retaliation, Chevron used its political and financial capital to countersue Steven for contempt of court, strip him of his law license, and detain him at home in prison for close to 3 years. While Steven continues the battle against Chevron, he also advocates for other victims of corporate malfeasance and offers legal interpretations of human rights issues. We thank you both, and Lisa is going to kick things off, so I'm going to turn the program over to you, Lisa.
Gosh, thank you so much, Diana and Kim and all the organizers. I'm really grateful for the invitation, and I'm joining you from Treaty 7 territory in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. So I'm really grateful that you've let a Canadian sneak into your program. I'm very kind of overwhelmed by the introductions and everything that was just said just now, because these are really weighty issues. And it's sometimes hard to know where to begin and how to start engaging. But I think before we dive in to start talking about the details of ecocide crime, I thought it might be useful just to sort of situate this campaign within a broader landscape, because there are some pretty seismic shifts underway in international law. And I think if we consider that, the law can both reflect our collective societal priorities and also be a tool for societal change. Right now, the international legal framework is under pressure to do both, to deliver on both in the face of this triple planetary crisis that we're facing. I think it's fair to say that the very relevance of international law is being tested. We are seeing in response some pretty innovative developments as a result. For example, as many will know, international human rights law is being engaged in some cases effectively to address environmental harm and to clarify states' obligations. And you'll know through your own work, I was excited to hear of this EJ Rod, is that what it's called? That this matters because by looking at climate and environmental harms through a human rights lens, we see the structural inequalities, we see the legacies of colonialism, we see the disparate impacts of environmental destruction on marginalized individuals and groups. And we've seen this play out in courts. In March, just this year, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, you might know this case, held Peru accountable for its failure to protect a local community in La Arroya against prolonged exposure to toxic pollution from a smelter complex. And the court in that case referred to the differential impact on children and the elderly, for example, and ordered Peru to adopt a whole range of reparation measures for the damage caused to the population. In April, the European Court of Human Rights delivered an important decision against Switzerland. I lived in Switzerland for a long time, and this is not a common news headline, but Switzerland was held to account for its failure to take sufficiently ambitious climate action or action to mitigate climate change in violation of its human rights obligations. And that case was brought by a group of senior women who highlighted the impact of climate change, and particularly heat waves, on the life and health of older women, as well as of the importance of intergenerational burden sharing. On another track, requests have been submitted for advisory opinions from international courts regarding states' obligations in the face of the planetary crisis. So these include the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, I had never heard of this tribunal until about a year ago. That tribunal issued an important opinion just a few weeks ago, clarifying that all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from any source constitute marine pollution, and with some important legal consequences. And there are two other courts, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the International Court of Justice, that have similarly been asked for advisory opinions, and these are eagerly anticipated by many. Although those opinions are not strictly legally binding, they can be influential as authoritative statements of the law. They can serve as a basis for climate litigation. They can influence public opinion. They can strengthen states' arguments in negotiations, in climate change negotiations, for example, and influence national law and policy. There are also initiatives underway to make greater use of existing international criminal law as a framework for accountability for harm to the environment. So, for example, right now, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is developing his first ever policy on the prosecution of environmental crimes. He's restricted to the crimes that already exist under the ICC statute, but this is an important development nonetheless. And then, of course, there's increasing interest among many to recognize a new international crime, ecocide, which could stigmatize and repudiate the most serious environmental wrongdoing. I think it's worth pausing to note that none of these are going to solve the planetary crisis, but they're potentially really powerful avenues to engage the law to address and prevent environmental harm in a more effective way and help shift our relationship with nature. And I think taken together, they also show that there's a growing demand for greater accountability towards the planet. And with some remarkable leadership coming from smaller states, from global youth, from civil society organizations, from feminist groups, from indigenous peoples, and so on. And so what about this movement to criminalize ecocide? I thought I would share 5 points with you for our conversation today. And the first is that there's a gap in the law, and that's been exposed. There have been, some advances, important advances, but overall, international environmental law, I think it's fair to say, is recognized as somewhat piecemeal and reactive. It's predominantly administrative and regulatory by nature, and contains very few concrete prohibitions. There are some environmental treaties that include provisions requiring states to criminalize specific conduct. But at the supranational level, the only offense against the environment in international criminal law is this narrowly conceived provision to protect against severe environmental harm in international armed conflict. At least that's the case under the ICC statute. So this means that most acts causing serious long-term or widespread environmental damage are not covered under existing definitions of international crimes. And yet, obviously, the scale and seriousness of the harm being done to the environment, if we consider that, they may well be considered as sort of quintessential global crimes because of their impact on the very conditions of life. And so criminalizing ecocide could fill this gap and provide a firm guardrail. The second point is that there's growing demand for this recognition, but maybe surprisingly, not to Steven and others that have been working on this for so many years, but the idea is not new. I was surprised to find this as I started to understand this issue. Already in the 1970s, during the Vietnam War, following the use of Agent Orange as a tool of destructive chemical warfare, an American biologist called Arthur Galston used the term ecocide to describe the willful, permanent destruction of environments in which people can live in a manner of their choosing. And he asked the international community to unite in condemnation of ecocide, just as it had condemned crimes against humanity and prohibited genocide after the Second World War. And others echoed this call. It was taken up by others with initiatives from a proposed international convention against ecocide in the 1970s, to studies undertaken by the United Nations in the 1980s. And the International Law Commission had even proposed to define ecocide as a crime against humanity in the draft Code of Crimes Against the Peace and Security of Mankind. But for various reasons, these efforts didn't amount to very much. And if we fast forward to today, I think the urgency of the climate, biodiversity, and pollution crisis is prompting a number of states, and a growing number of states and others, to call for the criminalization of ecocide. So the Stop Ecocide International was founded in 2017 by Polly Higgins and Jojo Mehta to support the movement to make ecocide an international crime. And in 2019, the small states of Vanuatu and the Maldives both called for serious consideration of an amendment to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. They wanted to see a conversation towards including ecocide as a fifth crime under that court statute. And in doing that, the ambassador of Vanuatu pointed to the scientific evidence of the existential threat posed by the climate crisis in highlighting the need for a strengthening of the international rule of law to respond. And since then, support has continued to grow. At a conference I was at in Amsterdam last week, the deputy prosecutor of the International Criminal Court delivered an incredible keynote presentation, and she wondered out loud in her speech whether, if the Rome Statute was drafted today, it would include ecocide as a separate international crime. So that brings us to our third point, which is around how to define this crime. In 2020, the Stop Ecocide Foundation, at the request of some Swedish parliamentarians, brought together an independent expert panel to answer this very question. And the panel included 12 lawyers from around the world with backgrounds in international criminal law, environmental law, climate law. And they were asked to put together a practical and effective definition of the crime of ecocide. And in June 2021, the panel published this proposed definition. According to the panel, ecocide means, and I quote, you can see on your screen, unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by these acts. And the panel included various explanations of the terms that are reflected in the definition, and you can consult those at the web link that's in the chat. It's really interesting to do a deep dive and see where the elements of the definition were drawn from, because they're largely based on existing international law principles. The panel's definition since then has been the subject of extensive commentary. It's also initiated a pretty serious global conversation and has served as a baseline for policy and legal initiatives that we can talk about in a minute. I don't want to go into detail on the definition. There's lots to be said, but I will just leave it there with more information if you want to research it on your own. So for a fourth point, what would adding ecocide to the ICC statute actually mean? We've already referred to the fact that this court is a treaty-based system. So it was established through the adoption of the Rome Statute at the turn of this century. And if you look at the Rome Statute and in the preamble, it reminds us that the very purpose of international criminal law is to contribute to ending impunity for the perpetrators of the most serious crimes of international concern, and in doing so to help prevent such crimes from occurring. And so many argue that placing ecocide within the Rome Statute alongside the existing ICC crimes would signal a moral and legal red line in terms of serious damage to the environment. It would also establish individual criminal responsibility for perpetrators and deter further harm. There's an interesting point I think, that's made, where the possibility of being held criminally responsible under the ICC could have a particularly important deterrent effect for business leaders, financiers, and insurers who could be particularly alert to reputational risk and to legal risks, along with the associated liabilities. In other words, the important or the power of this crime, I think, lies in its potential preventative influence, as the threat of being associated with an internationally recognized crime could help sort of shift business behavior and steer finance and investment towards more sustainable practices and away from the most harmful ones. I think it's interesting that the International Corporate Governance Network, which is this big network of investors that manages trillions of dollars, declared its support for an international crime of ecocide, referring to it as a game changer potentially for board directors. Because I think, after all, like everything else, businesses depend on a healthy ecosystem. So that brings us to the fifth and last point that I wanted to make, which is that this is happening. We've sort of moved from talking in a hypothetical to seeing ecocide codified in various different ways. So at the national level, ecocide crime is already codified in one form or another in a number of countries, including, interestingly, the Ukraine, where an ecocide investigation is underway in relation to conflict-related environmental harm. National ecocide legislation proposals more recently have moved forward in a number of places: Brazil, Mexico, Chile, the Netherlands, Italy, Peru, Spain, Scotland. And in February of this year, Belgium became the first European Union country to legislate against ecocide at both national and international levels. There's a really interesting regional development where recently the European Union revised what's called the Environmental Crimes Directive. That covers all EU countries, to establish EU-wide minimum rules on the definition of environmental offenses and penalties. And this new directive includes qualified criminal offenses that encompass conduct comparable to ecocide. That directive entered into force last month, and so EU member states now have a 2-year period to amend their national legislation to comply. And there are, of course, a lot of challenges ahead. Criminalizing environmental damage, particularly given our political and economic realities, is not simple. But I hope just this broad brush overview provides a sense of the possibilities that are being pursued to engage international law for the protection of the environment. And I will leave it there, but I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Really appreciate that. And we, that has given us sort of a broad foundation for ecocide and what it is. And now we are going to hear a very personal story from Steven Donziger. There you go, Steven. Why don't you tell us? I mean, Steven's story, I love this, is the worst oil-related disaster you've never heard of. And so I'm really happy to be able to share you with this group so that you can catch them up. And then we're going to connect some dots between what Lisa talked about, which you didn't have the advantage of having when you worked on this, and where you are now. So go ahead and jump in, Steven.
Thank you so much, Diana, for putting this together, for the great introduction. Thank you, Lisa, for that excellent overview. I actually learned a lot, and I want to get a copy, a written copy of what you just said. For those of you who don't know my story, I'm going to sort of get into it just ever so briefly. I'm a human rights attorney. Way back in 1993, for various reasons, I got involved with a group of lawyers who began to represent indigenous and farmer communities in Ecuador's Amazon against Chevron. Chevron had gone into Ecuador in the late 1960s, and over approximately 25 years had drilled hundreds of wells and had designed a system of oil extraction to deliberately pollute the forest, the ancestral lands. And they did this by basically, when you drill for oil, you bring a lot of oil waste up out of the ground. The hole to get the oil out is thousands of feet down. And when you drill it, there's a lot of very harmful heavy metals, toxins, man-made chemicals, carcinogens that come out, and they have to be disposed of. And Texaco, now Chevron, decided to just dump the stuff for the most part into rivers and streams that indigenous peoples and farmer communities relied on for their drinking water, for their bathing, and for their fishing. And I want to emphasize that the massive pollution that I encountered on my first trip to Ecuador's Amazon in 1993 was not an accident. This was done deliberately as a cost-saving mechanism. And over time, and I became very involved in this case from a legal standpoint, and I'm still working on it over 30 years later. But over time, the health impacts, the economic impacts, the cultural impacts of this original decision by Texaco executives to dispose of oil waste in such a reckless and irresponsible way, knowing full well, based on science, that people would die as a result of this decision. All of those decisions really led to a calamity, an ecological calamity and a human health calamity. And I just want to say that when I first, like 2017, 18, became aware of Polly's work and Jojo Mehta's work and this whole concept of ecocide as an atrocity crime, I sort of began to look into it and realized that had ecocide been considered an atrocity crime, perhaps the decision-making calculus of those Texaco executives would have been radically different. They would not have actually, designed a system of oil extraction to deliberately dump billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste into the environment. And it really raises a larger issue for me of gaps in the law. I think there's an enormous gap in the human rights field in terms of accountability between governmental actors and private actors. A lot of human rights law, and I defer to Lisa and others because I'm into it, but I'm not an expert and I'm not an academic. But there's a real gap I've noticed through this case and other cases where corporations commit significant, extensive acts of pollution and environmental destruction, and no one's ever held accountable. I mean, if you're lucky, you'll get a monetary judgment against the corporation that shareholders ultimately are responsible for. But the actual decision makers, the people saying, oh, we're going to build this particular system, knowing that it will eventually kill people sooner, even as well as over the long term, as has happened in Ecuador, these people get off scot-free. And I think one of the powerful components of the ecocide law, ecocide as an atrocity crime, is it will, should it become law in this way, shift personal responsibility to the actual decision makers. As Lisa points out, executives, board members, insurers, who ultimately could be held personally responsible in terms of criminal liability for causing this wanton destruction, severe destruction of the environment, and that in the case of Ecuador is actually killing people. So I can tell you as somewhat of a frustrated litigant, because I've been working on this so long, and one thing Diana didn't get into is Chevron attacked me personally. I mean, this is the ultimate irony of what happened to me and the people of Ecuador, is the people who perpetrated what I would call this environmental crime in the Amazon got off scot-free, or so far have. And instead of being held responsible, they actually paid lawyers to target those of us who, through a civil case, tried to impose some level of at least monetary accountability on the company, tried to force the company to pay damages for the harm caused to other people. And ultimately, they went after me personally and sued me for $60 billion in US courts and prosecuted me privately. I was targeted with the nation's first private corporate prosecution. It's a long story, but it was based on a contempt charge filed by a Chevron-connected judge who was angry at me because I refused to give Chevron my computer and confidential case file. And I was charged with a misdemeanor contempt of court. The regular federal prosecutor rejected the case, refused to prosecute me, and the judge appointed a private corporate law firm to prosecute me in U.S. courts on this misdemeanor contempt. And it turns out the law firm, the name of which is Seward and Kissel, had Chevron as a client, and the judge never disclosed this. So I essentially got prosecuted in the name of the U.S. government by Chevron, and I lost 3 years of my liberty. I spent 993 days in either home detention or in prison from 2019 to 2022. Completely took me off the map in terms of being able to work for my clients in Ecuador, who were left. A lot of lawyers worked on this case, by the way, but I was the main person raising the money and doing a lot of the kind of work to organize lawyers in other countries to enforce the judgment. They took my passport, took my law license, locked me up, and essentially left the communities in Ecuador defenseless, and they're still suffering. And many have died. So, my personal story, that is the story of me and my family, but my personal story as a professional who tried to do my job, and I think did it quite successfully for vulnerable communities in the Amazon, is one thing. But if we don't strengthen the rule of law, if we don't do things like make ecocide a law, the fifth international atrocity crime, if we don't somehow do things to get our court systems, not just in the United States, but in other countries, to take these human rights issues and these issues of environmental, destruction and planetary threat seriously, we're not going to be able to make the progress we need in the time frame needed to really save the planet or create the sustainable planet that we all want. I salute Lisa, I salute Philippe Sands and Jojo and all the people who spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. I'm a practitioner. Like, I've been to Ecuador 250 times. I was chopping wood every day for years. I mean, literally, there was not a day I did not think about this or try to do something to advance the ball so the affected communities could get a remedy. And, that gives you one perspective. When you teach this stuff and look at it from an academic standpoint, and I know that's not all Lisa does, but there are people who need to do this, who need to define this. I mean, the definition of ecocide is created by the commission that the Stop Ecocide campaign convened in 2021, I believe it was, is really important. And I want to point out, as a matter of how to create change in our world, a lot of things start with simple ideas, and they gain momentum. Lisa pointed out all the countries right now and cities, including in the United States and around the world, who are now, embracing the ecocide concept as law and passing domestic legislation or introducing domestic legislation to make ecocide a crime in specific countries, even if it's not yet accepted internationally as an atrocity crime. And all of this is a really good way to make change. By the way, it's what the right wing does all the time with crazy ideas. They just throw them out there, and suddenly people latch onto them and they gain momentum. So I think what the Stop Ecocide movement is doing is critically important. It's important that all of us in our communities promote this through city councils, through state governments, through conversations like this. I'll also point out that it's crazy given what I've personally experienced, but I really believe in the law. Now, I'm very aware of the limitations of the law, for both out of what I've experienced with the case against Chevron, but just what I've observed as a person watching how the world operates. The legal systems generally reflect the power structure of the society in which they reside. But there's a lot of beautiful laws and aspiration built into the law that can motivate people to act. that can motivate people to do things such that courts start responding to public pressure and to new ideas, and advances are made. I don't believe if you only work within the four walls of the law, we're never going to get there. But you have to push the law. The law will be responsive with enough pressure and with enough well-meaning people like Lisa and others, judges, to really take their job seriously and be fair and care about using the law to really do justice in this world, which is what it's intended to do, and these battles are ongoing. They never end. I mean, the Chevrons of the world weaponize law to create injustice or to protect injustice and to protect profits and to protect destruction. And all of this is up for grabs. So the whole Stop Ecocide movement, to me, is a major, major part of what's really important in terms of civil society moving these issues forward in a way that the law can be useful to help save the planet. And I'll also close by just pointing out there's another very important movement beyond the Ecocide, the Stop Ecocide law movement that Polly and Jojo started in London, is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I don't know if you folks know about that, but that's organized largely out of Canada, but that's gone global too. There's now 13 countries that have signed on to this treaty. Colombia just signed on. It's the largest country. I'm looking for Brazil, Mexico to sign on. And this is a treaty that's sort of like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty from decades ago. It basically calls on all countries to commit to making no new investments in fossil fuels. And simple concept. Every country should sign on. Every country, especially the United States, China, India, the big polluters, need to come up with national plans to phase out fossil fuels and do things to comply with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the Stop Ecocide law, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there's other laws that sort of connect more with our democracy. So those of us who advocate, like me, Pablo Fajardo, my client, my colleagues in Ecuador, have the political space to do the legal work and the advocacy work and the campaigning work to make all of this happen without being locked up in prison, without being prosecuted by a corporation. I'm sitting right now in a hotel room in Washington, D.C. And the reason I'm here is because tomorrow morning at 11:45 a.m., we're having a rally in front of the White House to demand President Biden pardon me for my misdemeanor criminal contempt conviction that derived from the fact I refused to give my computer to Chevron because I was protecting the lives of my clients and protecting the concept of attorney-client privilege and protecting the concept of our rule of law. Our society is based in the rule of law. And I'll close by saying, if you want to help with this campaign, we have a website called freedonziger.com. Just pop on there and we have a petition. If you haven't been there yet, sign the petition. We're trying to get thousands and thousands of people in the United States and around the world to sign the petition. We have leaders from, major environmental groups and human rights groups like Amnesty International, Greenpeace, Climate Defiance, Sunrise Movement, and many others coming tomorrow to speak. Congressman Jim McGovern is coming, and a couple of other congresspersons are coming as well. And we're going to fight our asses off to get Biden to deal with this. Okay, we cannot live, if we expect to save our planet, in a society where corporations can put people, human rights lawyers, in jail. It's wrong. And you don't have to like me, is what I tell people. Hope you like me, but you don't have to like me. You don't have to like my work. You don't have to like environmentalism to agree that a corporation in a rule of law country should not be able to prosecute someone privately. Okay. And the biggest irony is I took my damn misdemeanor non-jury trial contempt conviction where I was denied a jury and really denied the right to defend myself and served almost over 4 times the maximum sentence because they kept me locked up at home for over 2 years before I could even get a trial where the maximum sentence was 6 months, before I could even go to court for trial. So we're going to, and by the way, I see this as a major test for President Biden on issues of human rights and rule of law and climate. Pardon me, and correct this injustice. I did take it to the Supreme Court. I had a very good legal team led by Stephen Vladeck, who's a professor at the time at UT Austin Law School. And the way the Supreme Court takes cases is all 9 justices meet in conference once a week during the term. And they met on my case. This has never happened before, 5 times. They could not decide. There was some battle going on. And ultimately, they refused to take my appeal. I believe if they had taken it, I would have won and had my conviction reversed by 9-0-8-1-7-2 vote. But 2 justices, this is very unusual, dissented from the denial of granting my appeal a hearing. And those justices were Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. And what's happened, and all I needed was 2 of the 3 centrist liberals to join them, and they would have taken my appeal, and I would have not been seeking a pardon. My case would have been reversed. I don't know what my point is, except to say that at this point, for me personally, this goes beyond right-left politics. This is about basic rule of law issues. And I need help. My clients in Ecuador need help. Ecocide law is a huge way to help. Get that thing made into law. People like Lisa, Jojo need to be supported. Those countries pushing this need to be supported. And on a personal level, those people like myself and many, many others who are on the front lines and confronting these corporate structures that are really ruining the planet need to be protected. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the high honor of being invited to share my story with each of you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to just remove your spotlight for a second because I think it's important for people to have an image of what you're talking about. And so I want to share my screen to show you a few images. And Stephen, feel free to speak over these.
Sure.
this
Thank you.
is-
I forgot that we had these pictures. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. This is what Chevron did to the Amazon. Of course, the Amazon is our lungs for the world, as it is often referred to.
So that first picture was a waste pit. Chevron left about 1,000 of these. This is called drilling muds in industry parlance. And it's like the stuff that comes out of the ground when you drill a well. And in the United States, it's disposed of properly, either through a line pit where eventually it's either incinerated depending on the conditions, but it's not left there. I mean, this pit has been there and it's still there for probably 40 years.
Mm.
And this is the rainforest. I mean, it's not virgin forest anymore. People have cut a lot of this stuff down. But a lot of these pits, there's about 1,000 of them, have pipes that Texaco installed on the sides to drain off the contents of the pits, because it rains a lot, into the rivers and streams that people drink out of. This is another pit, more of a formed pit. And these are like the pipes. It's really...
And then the fire that they just
And they burn the pits, and that creates massive air, poisonous air pollution. And this stuff's been out there 50 years. There's a lot of pollution problems in the United States, and a lot of these companies will just let this stuff sit there for as long as they can get away with it. But I don't think you would see such a systematic dumping in the United States as you see in this isolated part of Ecuador.
So Great. Thank you. And we put the link in. I saw somebody has already signed on to the petition. I just before we, I think it's worth sharing that site, because if you'd like to learn more, there's a ton of information. This is the freedonziger.com site. There's a ton of information about, you can sign the petition, you can donate to the legal defense. There was some news this week, which we included in our newsletter, lots of articles, the information about the Congress members who are supporting you, who will be there tomorrow, and this great video. So thank you, Stephen. We really appreciate that. And what I'm going to do is add you and Lisa to spotlight you. And we have a few questions that we would like to kick off with, and then we invite everyone on the call to put your questions in the chat. And after these few questions that we want to ask, we will come to your questions. So go ahead and start adding those as let's see. So we should have you two there. And yeah, Kim, I'm going to add you in here too, because you have some, like myself.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. We're keying up the questions here.
Okay.
Perfect.
Lisa, should ecocide be criminalized? Could businesses like Chevron be prosecuted? And if so, what would be the punishment?
Oh, that's a great question. Obviously, corporate activity is often at the source of ecocide. I think Stephen's just laid that out in glaring detail. The short answer, if we're talking about an international crime under the International Criminal Court jurisdiction, is actually no, because the ICC exercises jurisdiction only over natural persons, not legal persons like corporations. But the better answer is that yes, it would apply to business actors. And there's two reasons for that. One is that the jurisdictional limitation to natural persons only applies to the ICC. So if a state were to ratify the amendment to recognize ecocide crime and then adopt that in its national jurisdiction, then they could certainly adopt direct corporate criminal liability. And so in addition to punishing persons, they could sanction the corporation as an entity, and some countries do that. But secondly, even at the ICC, the law applies to actions and decisions of individuals who work within a corporation or a business. So ecocide law would still apply to CEOs or board directors, for example. I think that's the quick answer.
And the punishment, would it just be monetary or retribution, or what kind of punishment would they get?
I think the crimes that we're talking about under the ICC jurisdiction are, as Stephen said, they're atrocity crimes. They're the most serious crimes recognized under international law. And so they attach an individual criminal responsibility, which means, in sentencing, it's certainly, this is, I think, the point of moving beyond administrative penalties or monetary sanctions against corporations that very often build this into a business model, to holding senior decision makers to account. And where they meet this high threshold, then yes, that means international criminal liability, which means more often than not jail sentence.
Great. And for Stephen, you alluded to this, but do you think your story would have a different ending today because of the ecocide movement, that momentum that's been building, the understanding of the kind of the impact that these, for example, the oil spill in Amazon? Do you think it would have been different for you having that support, that understanding, that recognition of the enormity of that crime?
I've thought about this a bit. I mean, I think it might have been different for the communities in the Amazon, because I think that if the executives knew that they could face jail time, because that's what Lisa's saying,
Mhm.
if they were to do what they did, I think there's a much better chance they would not have done it that way. And there would have been far less harm, far fewer deaths, far less destruction. And I might have actually done something else with my life that would not have resulted in me being detained. You know, and
Yeah.
I also think that, you know, to the extent there's a broad global movement in favor of human rights and, you know, environmental rights. And by the way, I think, you know, sort of the elephant in the room, but if you look what's happening with the International Court of Justice on the genocide case against Israel right now, you are seeing, I think, a very deep awakening in consciousness around the world among the public about the role of law and how international human rights law can actually protect people, or that's kind of a bad way to say it because so many people are being harmed and hurt and killed in that region right now, but how international human rights law can play an important role in, you know, constraining these types of behaviors that cause such widespread harm, be they through war or through environmental practices like the one Chevron used in Ecuador. And like one of the things I just really love about the idea of ecocide as an atrocity crime, by the way, that would make it equal to genocide, you know, in the eyes of the law. But like, you know, in Gaza right now, you're seeing in just a few short months, you know, massive, massive, massive death. And not just from military weapons, airstrikes, but through lack of food, water, sanitation, medical care. Okay. And in Ecuador, while it doesn't look as spectacular and, you know, it's not as visible, you are seeing slow motion, incremental, decade after decade, death and destruction. And it's about time, especially given the implications not only for these vulnerable communities in the Amazon and other parts of the world, but for all of us and all of life's ecosystems and all species, the implications of our planet not being on a sustainable path are so dire, they're so great, that it is entirely appropriate, in my view, that we make ecocide the moral and legal equivalent of genocide. So, you know, the thing that I try to do when I talk about this is explain, and I'm probably not that great at it because it's so hard to capture what's really happening in Ecuador in words. And even in those pictures, it doesn't do it justice. But like there are a lot of similarities here. And we need to get our arms around the idea that environmental destruction can be the same as destruction of life caused by war. You know, and I think they are the same. So short answer is, had ecocide been in the law, codified in the law, back when Texaco was going into Ecuador in the 1960s, I think there might have been a very different result.
You talked about the Ecuadorian people and we saw those images. Is there anything that they've been able to do to reverse the damage that Chevron caused? You said it's just been going on and on. Is there anything that's helping to reverse it for them?
Well, let me just say this as part of the legal case that we won. I want to make one other point. This case is not over. I went to jail, but I'm here, I'm speaking out, and there's other lawyers working on this, not just me. And the plan is ultimately to force Chevron to comply with the rule of law and pay the judgment via legal actions around the world. So this case is far from over. The last chapter has not been written. And, you know, the fact that they've locked me up and still have my passport and haven't left the country for 5 years shows you that they actually feel deep financial risk from this case. And I believe ultimately the people of Ecuador will win it irrespective of what happens to me personally. And I mean, they've already won it, but will recover what they're owed, irrespective of what happens to me personally. And I hope it happens.
So too.
You know what I'm saying? So I just want to make that clear. Was there a question in there? I might have forgotten it.
Yeah, just wondering if the Ecuadorian people have been able to reverse the
Oh,
damage.
so what I want to say is the damage is out there. There's been no cleanup. There's been some water tanks and things put into so some people can have clean water, but it doesn't solve any of the underlying problems. I want to emphasize that as part of our case, we propose a cleanup plan to the court, which was the basis for the court to impose the monetary damages on Chevron. There's a plan. Experts put it together that we enlisted because this kind of destruction is so vast, it's so extensive, and it's such a biodiverse, delicate ecosystem that there is literally no playbook in history for a cleanup of this magnitude in this kind of environment. So it is going to take all hands on deck, technical expertise, community involvement, and global support for the cleanup to happen. But it can't happen. There is a plan. It's not irreversible. But unfortunately, because Chevron refuses to pay the judgment and has forced these vulnerable communities that have virtually no money to chase them around the world, to Brazil, to Argentina, to Canada, and other countries to collect the judgment, while I'm locked up or unable to leave the United States, nothing has happened yet. But it can happen. And I predict that it will happen. I mean, isn't it kind of pathetic? I'm fighting for a pardon rather than actually doing my job, trying to enforce this judgment.
Yeah, yeah.
That's exactly what they wanted, but I have no choice.
Thank you for, standing tall and holding that space of legal right and human right. So, of course, you couldn't have given up your laptop. I mean, that would not have.
And by the way, had I given it, they would have found something else. It wasn't about that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Kim, why don't we just ask one more question, and then I think we want to jump to the chat and start to ask some questions from the folks on the call.
Well, I guess just a personal note for Lisa, what led you to work on the issue of ecocide?
That's a great question. I had an opportunity a few years ago. I left the UN, and I was very lucky to have some space to really decide what I wanted to dive into, what was my sort of top priority. And I really decided that I needed to work on what kept me up at night most. There's a lot of things that keep me up at night, but the thing that sort of kept me up the most, and that was obviously engaging with whatever tools I could, bring to bear on this crisis that we're in. And I think, over my work with the UN over about 20 years in different parts of the world, I had opportunities to work on complex challenges and to see the relevance of international law, in particular human rights law, in addressing these. It's a very surprisingly, nimble's the wrong word, but it's an adaptable body of international law, a part of international law that has evolved and has continued to evolve to rise to the challenges that we face. And I think that is clear in this context. We have a newly recognized universal right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, thanks to the influence of the rights of nature movement. There's recognition now within human rights law of the intrinsic value of nature, not as just a resource for humans to use. And this is really critical, and I think this is linked directly to ecocide crime. Human rights law requires states to use all the means at their disposal, including the criminal law, to protect human rights, including the right to a healthy environment. So I just sort of felt that this is a very relevant body of law that needs to be brought to bear to protect the planet. And I've been really lucky to link arms with some incredible people. And that's, I'm sleeping a little bit better at night thanks to all of the great people that are doing this work. So just to echo what Stephen was saying, you know, we need to protect environmental defenders as human rights defenders.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for speaking. And are you up for some questions from the group? We will go to those. So Kathy, I think you have the first question. I'm going to take Kim and I off, and we'll just hear from our guests. Kathy?
Okay. Yes, I have the first question from Karen, who would like to have you explain again, Stephen, when and why you could not get an appeal with the Supreme Court, why they wouldn't take your case.
Sure. So the case I appealed was my criminal contempt conviction, my misdemeanor conviction that led to my pretrial detention for over 2 years, and then a non-jury trial where I was convicted by a judge who was a member of the Federalist Society, which Chevron is a big donor to, and a very pro-corporate judge. I never had a chance. So I appealed that to the first level appeal in New York, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and you get a 3-judge panel, and all 3 judges agreed that it was wrong, but 2 of them affirmed the decision anyway, claiming I didn't properly raise it at the trial level, and I lost it on appeal. The 3rd judge, who was appointed by Donald Trump, wrote a beautiful 19-page dissent that then really became the basis for, I think, this debate that took place when I appealed that to this U.S. Supreme Court. But just to be clear, the U.S. Supreme Court, for those who don't know, takes very few cases. They might take 50 or 60 cases a year. They might get 7,000, 8,000 petitions of certiorari, meaning litigants who ask them to take their appeal. So it's very low chance that any particular case will be accepted. So the fact that my appeal got as far as it did, they were debating it for weeks and weeks, and ultimately 2 justices wrote a dissent on the denial of my appeal, was actually, even though it was disappointing in one sense, it was extremely beneficial in another. And, it enables me now it provides a certain level of protection to me and others who might be faced with this, because trial judges now know that 2 and probably more justices on the Supreme Court disapprove of this. But it doesn't ultimately get me to where I need to get to have the full rights of a typical citizen, which is, I can't earn a living. I don't even have a bank account, by the way, because Chevron literally took all my money because they got the judge to order me to reimburse them their millions of dollars of legal fees they used to persecute me. And it's possible I'll never have my own money again. I have a legal defense fund, by the way, which is how I support myself and pay my legal fees. People donate into the fund, which you can also find on the website freedonziger.com if you want to help. But I have literally had thousands of people around the world make small donations to this fund that has enabled me to survive. And but ultimately, I'm really disappointed in the U.S. courts. I just shocked, actually, that they let me sit there in detention on a misdemeanor. By the way, no lawyer charged with contempt of court had ever served 1 day in the history of this country prior to trial locked up. And I served over 2 years because this was such a political case. It was such a vengeance case. And the fact that no appellate court stopped it, I still find shocking. I do have hope because 3 judges, 1 Second Circuit Appeals Court judge and 2 Supreme Court justices have declared my case unconstitutional. And that's good. So has, by the way, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Ruled 5 jurists on that body, which is a UN human rights body, ruled that my detention was illegal, and they ordered the US government to compensate me. Biden administration has totally ignored that decision. They just ignored it, hadn't responded, hadn't done anything with it. But I do have a lot of support, and objective lawyers who look at what happened to me tend to agree with me. But ultimately, I couldn't get my own country's courts to stop this. I thought the Supreme Court was going to step in. I just felt like they could really do it. It would have completely changed the landscape for the people of Ecuador, for me personally, and they just didn't do it. So here I am a year later in a hotel next to the White House ready to have a rally tomorrow. But I'm not giving up.
Well, I guess you're the definition of, I don't know, perseverance, strength. I can't even imagine. Anyway, we will go on to the next question. Terry?
Yes, the next question is from Narit Katz. She asks, are the people working on ecocide law working with the people working on the rights of nature?
I mean, I can take that. There's a quick answer to that. Absolutely. The fundamental connection and partners. I think, ecocide would be the first ecocentric crime to find its way into the Rome Statute if it were to be accepted. And that wouldn't happen, I don't think, without the developments coming from the rights of nature movement. I think the influence is seen in the different bodies of law, in human rights law, and now in international criminal law. So definitely there's some interesting links if you want to look on the Stop Ecocide website to the various different partners and the different networks. The networks that Stop Ecocide is engaged with are really interesting, from farmers to musicians and artists to oceanographers, faith leaders, students, etc. So definitely rights of nature movement is part of the partnerships.
I just wanted to insert before we go to the next question. Stephen mentioned that he has we've asked about petition and also donation, because that supports him in his legal defense fund right now. And Stephen, don't you have like a 3-for-1 match going on right now until the end of
I
June?
do. I have a donor. We're trying to raise $50,000 this month. Really, most of that money is going to be used to get organizers out there to get people around the world to mobilize people to write the White House to get my pardon. I had a huge boost last week because 50 NGOs wrote a letter to Biden on my behalf. I mean, Greenpeace, Amazon Watch, Rainforest Action Network, Amnesty International, and others, like big, important groups. So yeah, we need to keep pushing this. And the one person said that he would match any donation up to $25,000 total this month with a 3 times match. So it's a huge opportunity. No one's ever offered that for this campaign.
Right.
So if you give, $50, it'll really be $150. $10, 30, $1,000, 3,000, whatever. So I didn't come on here tonight to ask for money, but if you do want to help, there is an opportunity there where you could really, magnify whatever you can give this
Great.
month.
And you can get to that donation through the freedonziger.com site, where you can either sign the petition or both. One thing you said to me in our conversation a few months ago was just how much you wanted to reach out to other global climate activists, that you see your journey not as just about you, but you really see it as sort of plowing the trail, if you will, for other climate activists, so that they are not treated the same as you. So just want to thank you for that, and let everybody know that, even though this is US, you're asking for a pardon from our president, you really do want to make a global impact with this case, right?
Yeah. And I just want to say also that, if President Biden doesn't pardon me, I'll keep pushing for it next year, and on. But it's not the end of the game. I mean, pardon would help me tremendously. It's the right thing to do, not just for matter of fairness to me and the people of Ecuador, but just for the principles of the rule of law in our country, out of respect for those who advocate for environmental justice and for climate justice. He really should do this. It's really not a close call in my mind. He should do this. But if he doesn't do it, there's we work on multiple avenues all the time, including other lawyers who are working to enforce the judgment, the environmental judgment against Chevron and other countries, et cetera, et cetera. So, we and me personally try to put all my eggs in one basket, but the pardon thing is so doable. And I actually think it would benefit the president to pardon me politically. I really do, although he should do it because this is the right thing to do. But I actually think he would get an electoral benefit were he to do it because it's the right thing to do, and it would make him look good with people who care about the environment, particularly youth climate groups whose votes he needs. So not to be too transactional about it, but I think it makes sense. And I don't think it's out of the question. I think he could do it.
Cheryl, I think you have a question from the chat.
This is from Marianne King, who attended late and is asking, are there other attorneys that are involved with the same ecocide issue in Ecuador? And she wants to get an idea of how many law firms are working on this, or if it's just you.
So many, many law firms have worked on this case over the years. It's gone on for over 30 years. Some firms work for a few years and move on. Others come at different times. There's been dozens and dozens of mostly very able lawyers who worked on this over the years. And I want to emphasize that it's not my case. Yes, I played a big role in this case, but without all these other lawyers, like Pablo Fajardo was the lead lawyer in Ecuador, not me. And by the way, he was on this commission that wrote the definition of the ecocide law, my colleague Pablo Fajardo. So, these types of things take a collective effort. They really do. I feel a little awkward because so much attention is often put on me. And in a way, Chevron designed it that way. They locked me up, and everyone wants to. They forced me to come out and talk about this so I could protect myself to some degree. But sometimes it's deceptive because it makes it look like it's like me against them. They literally, by the way, had 2,000 lawyers working on this over the years. We might have had 50 to 100 lawyers at different times working on this. So there's a lot of lawyers who worked on this. It's not just me.
Great. I have the next question from Gregory Wright, who is asking about UN Secretary General Antonio, I'm going to say it incorrectly, Guterres, who has been calling out the slow motion destruction of climate stability as the world continues relentlessly to burn fossil fuels. Has Guterres put a spotlight on the Ecuador atrocity or on the general challenge of ecocide?
I mean, I can answer that on the criminalization of ecocide generally, and maybe Stephen, do you want to follow up after? The UN Secretary General has been vocally supportive of the criminalization of ecocide at the international level. And interestingly, just last month, there was a report of the Secretary General on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. And in that report, which goes to the UN Security Council, by the way, he again expressed his, he highlighted the need to establish a crime of ecocide at the international level. So he has, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has been very outspoken in favor of criminalizing ecocide at the international level, and specifically under the ICC jurisdiction. Stephen, I don't know if you want to follow up.
Yeah, he has not, as far as I know, said anything about the Ecuador case. And we haven't really pushed it with him. I mean, it's never sort of been, we've availed ourselves of the human rights bodies in the United Nations at various times to help protect the defenders and to help do certain things that were needed, but we've never asked for a pronouncement. Maybe we should, but we have not.
How are we doing with questions? Do we have any more for the chat?
I think Maureen had a question. Maureen's question what would be the legal ramifications when oil drilling occurs in the ocean? Any ideas on that?
Lisa, you
Lisa.
mentioned something about the ocean a while ago as a marine protection. Is that something you can address?
Well, I think it would go back to looking at the definition of ecocide. If there is an act that caused, if we're looking at the definition proposed by the independent panel, if you're looking at an act that were to cause severe and either widespread or long-term harm to the marine environment, then yes, potentially it could.
By the way, I just wanted to ask, I know somebody put the phone number of the White House. Stephen, would it help for people to call in regarding the petition? So I'm just going to suggest, because we're a chapter that likes to take action. So tomorrow at 11:45 is 8:45 our time, right? So maybe we can all call in at 8:45 tomorrow morning and ask President Biden to support that petition.
That would be great. And the other thing I want to say is, if you want to watch the rally, the man who works with me is going to be live streaming it on my Instagram account.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks for letting us know. And I believe you are at Steven Donziger, right? And in
That's
terms
correct.
of your handle? Okay, great. We'll pop that into the chat. Any final questions? Kathy?
I think we have a lot of really interesting and thought-provoking comments. So I appreciate everybody's comments and questions.
Well, thank you very much. We love to turn off our mute at this point and just let you know how we really feel and appreciate you. So all the attendees, I welcome you to unmute and just give a big shout out for our guest tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for all your hard work,
Thank
both
you.
of you.
Good luck tomorrow,
Amazing.
Stephen. Hope that
Thank you.
goes really well.
Thank you.
Fingers
We're
crossed.
calling for you.
You're
Thank you
so
amazing.
much. You're so amazing.